welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Spinner. I am a novelist myself and a high school English teacher, and I'm excited on this week to be talking to a new author that I haven't had the chance to interview before. I'm going to be talking to Pierre C. Arsenault, and we're going to be talking about his book, Something Happened in Carlton, recently published from New Mexico publisher Artemisia Publishing. Pierre, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Pierre Arsenault. Yeah, I'm originally from Atlantic Canada, from New Brunswick. Been writing fiction for about 15 years now. Was a published cartoonist before that, and just the creativity. You can't stifle that once you have it, and once you open that up, it's hard to stop it. So I've been writing for a little while now. That's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, that's so true. Like once I think you start down a path of like expressing yourself creatively, there's just something that compels you to keep going.
Becomes a bit of a fire inside of you.
Absolutely. Well, and you've got multiple paths, and we'll get into that a little bit more because I'm curious to see where and how they might intersect. But before I get off on too many rabbit trails, tell us a little bit about Something Happened in Carlton.
That is a novel that, if I'm going to tell you about it, I'm going to start in the very beginning. I originally wrote a story called Nothing Ever Happens in Carlton. It was a novella included in my short story collection called Sleepless Nights. That's something I published in 2014, so over 10 years ago. And that short story collection introduced the setting of Carlton, as some of the short stories were set in that town. It introduced a lot of the characters, especially in the last story in the book. And then, as you know, sometimes you get almost a longing to go back to these places. And that's how this book came about. I really wanted to go back to that setting. I wanted to write about it again. I wanted to write about that cast of characters again. And so I started one day. I just had this idea that I pictured Clovis McPhee, the police chief, in a dirt driveway overlooking a pile of garbage, which ended up being a feud between two neighbors. And I just took it from there.
I love when that happens, when your characters are just like, well, we're not quite done yet. We need your attention again, so come back. Can produce some really interesting, fun writing experiences.
I'm a big believer in, some people say that characters write themselves. I'm a big believer that no, they don't, because they're all a part of it. Every single character you write somehow comes from you somehow, some way. There's a bit of you in every character, either the despicable ones and the likable ones. There's going to be a little bit of you in all of them. To me, I just had to go back to them. I just love them so much. This book introduces new characters that weren't in the original. 93-year-old Eli Woodman, Miss Musgrave, who's an elderly lady as well. It's not all elderly characters, but there's quite a few that were just so charming and fun to write.
Well, and tell us a little bit about how you structured the novel, because it's not necessarily like you have, one or two main characters and we follow them and there's this one arc that they're all involved in. It's a little bit different in its structure, and I really enjoyed how you put everything together. Tell us a little bit about that and how you decided to weave your various characters into the story.
I've had that comment quite a bit, and one of the feedback I normally get from people is when they read my books, they feel like they're watching a movie. By that meaning that the story, a lot of the times I'll feature main characters, but I'll sideline into side characters as well, and I'll flesh them out. And a lot of times I do that. To me, it is a bit like a movie, because what you're getting the view of all kinds of different characters and what's happening to them as well. Just to follow one character, I have a difficult time in doing that. To tell a tale with a larger cast is what I seem to naturally gravitate to. So far, most of my writing is like that. I don't normally just follow the one character or a couple characters.
That's interesting, and I'm glad that you brought up that even with some of your, what would I think typically be considered like tertiary characters, you still put quite a bit of effort into developing them and giving them really interesting characteristics. And that was something that stood out to me. I teach high school, and right now we're doing our narrative unit. And so part of that is, types of characters and introducing them to that primary, secondary, tertiary characters. And we're putting them in columns and listing them all out as we go. And tertiary is a hard one for them to remember because they don't even know how to pronounce it when we first start. And so we keep going back to like, okay, what is this character's role in the story? Do they have a specific purpose and then they disappear? And it's a helpful place to start with young people because they often don't think about that. But it's interesting when you're the one who's doing the writing that sometimes those characters will only come in for, half a page are still really interesting, and you as the writer like want to dig into them a little bit more, even though like they come and they serve their purpose in those couple paragraphs and then they're off. And so that was something I did want to ask you about, was the level of your character development I felt was really rich. And even those characters that we don't see a whole lot of, I found intriguing and interesting. What is your approach to character development just in general?
Well, you basically described it. I mean, I like rich characters. I like, by that I mean fleshed out. I also don't find I flesh them out enough. I don't give you physical descriptions enough because I like the reader to maybe make up some of those details for themselves. But I do love side characters. I find when I'm writing something, every character is there for a reason. I once said in an author's note, you don't create a plumber if you need an archaeologist. Every character is going to have a purpose. It's going to have a reason for being there. But sometimes you need people to play off of. So you need a secondary character. Like, for example, the Miss Musgrave character. She only exists because I needed somebody to play off of with the Mayor Jack Ledger. I needed somebody to play off of that dynamic. I wanted something to happen with the Christmas lights in July in this novel, but I also didn't want to just have that be an anonymous person that was doing that without having the dynamic of that character and the interactions. So I created Miss Musgrave with the intention of she's the one who's got her Christmas lights up and she's got a motive behind it. Why is she doing it? And then that gave me a reason to have that comical interaction between the mayor and her. There's always, like, when you have side characters, I find they have a role to play, and there's no reason why you can't flesh out that dynamic, that storyline.
I think you just never know, too, like how a character might develop over the course of like, well, I needed them for this one thing, but they keep kind of developing and growing in your head. And you're like, oh, actually, they could be this or that, or I could use them here and there. Kind of those surprise characters who you think are going to be one thing, and then they end up really blossoming into something else.
Yeah, that's very true. Like, for example, the character, I'm trying to remember her name off the top of my head because I'm a little blanky right now, but the reporter, Bonnie Campbell, she is an older woman who has a local newspaper, but see, I originally created her in the first book, because in the first book, the newspaper was kind of prevalent. It was important into the story, in the first story, in the setting. So when I wrote this one, I had to include her. I had to bring her back, and that's the only reason she reappears, but then I wanted to give her her own struggle. Newspapers aren't really doing that great these days. So that was a great way to bring her in, the struggling newspaper, things going on. There's always room to develop characters if you want to do it, in my opinion.
Well, and I'm getting the sense that you're more of a character-driven writer than, like, say, like a strict plot structure development.
To a degree, yes. You mentioned earlier, how did I structure the book? I've not always done my books the same. In this one here, I have every chapter is basically what I call the part, and I gave each part a title, and I tried to fit that title to basically everything I did in that. That was a structure that I did for this book particularly. I really enjoyed doing it, so I aimed for that for the entire structure of the book. But you're right that I am more character-driven, that's for sure.
Do you ever run into any challenges with starting with your characters and developing them and bringing them to life in your head, and then maybe they don't fully fit or cooperate with the plot you had in mind to start with, and then you kind of have to make adjustments as you go?
I'm going to say yes, but a lot of times, as a writer yourself, you probably know this. You probably get this great idea, you jot it down, you have all these notes, and then when you start writing, do you even look at the note? Sometimes I don't. And for some reason, I don't go back to that note. So if I had notes on this character being a certain way or a certain thing, sometimes I don't even go back to them. As I'm writing, I'm redeveloping the idea, rethinking it through, and sometimes it'll lead me in different ways, so the character will end up being different than I originally anticipated. Sometimes if you need them to do a certain thing, you're going to maybe tweak the character to fit that narrative. It is fascinating.
Yeah, I kind of marvel at writers who can come up with an idea in their head and then like carry it out exactly as they intended. Because I'm like, I don't think I've ever been able to do that with any of my books. It always kind of takes some sort of detour, or a new character pops up or something like that, where it's like you grow with the story and the characters as you're writing it, and your ideas change. And it's such an interesting process, and I love hearing how it works for everybody else as they go through their writing also.
Yeah, it's definitely not always the same process. As a writer, anybody creative, I find you evolve as you go along. Through my first writings, my first short stories that I was dabbling in, just to find your feet, find your voice. I find that I've developed my style over the time. I've also written in collaboration with a friend of mine. Her and I have written some books, the Oakland Island series, for example. Those are approached completely different than in all this that my solo works, because you don't have a choice but plot out things when you're writing with somebody. So then you lay out bones and you decide what's going to happen per chapter, or maybe general bones, or maybe more detail. And then you can write based on that. And those kind of projects are usually approached differently than something where I've done solo, where I've just made it up from start to finish without, basically the term is pantsing. I made it up as fly by the seat of your pants kind of thing. Those, I find, whenever I do that, I tend to go on tangents that I never anticipated.
Yeah, I imagine that's a very different process, working with someone else and having to balance those ideas and kind of build your ideas cooperatively. I've done a little bit of that here and there, but never with a full novel. And yeah, that would be a really interesting experience. I would think it would push you to grow in interesting ways as a writer.
What I find it does is it takes you in different directions that you would have never thought of going. Whenever I work with Angela, like for the Oakland Island series, for example, we'll bounce ideas off each other. Sometimes you'll go in a direction you would have never thought of because the other one suggested something or said something that made you think of something else. When you're writing on your own, it's almost like knitting something. You're kind of building as you're going, and you're adding and adding and adding. But as you're adding, sometimes you go in directions you didn't plan. Whereas if you plot, you kind of have a direction planned out. Like Carlton, I wrote that entire book without planning anything. All I knew was what I wanted the premise to be, and I had a general idea how I wanted to end. And so I just kind of started writing and kept on going.
So with the various storylines for each character, because they all kind of have their own challenges and issues that they're dealing with, but they all weave together within, being part of this small town, you can't help but kind of end up in each other's business. Having those experiences and challenges cross over. So it sounds like a lot of that developed organically as you were writing, rather than maybe having like firm goals or paths for various characters and then planning out the intersections.
Definitely. The only time I can say that I plotted out more, something like that, was in my novel Poplar Falls. Poplar Falls, I kept getting stuck, and I had to plot it out, and I did that. But in Carlton, something happened in Carlton. It was just, sometimes you have a scene where you're going to do something with the character. Well, you need somebody to bounce off, to work with, have another character interact with. So you bring in the other character. But then that leads you to have that character do something else. And then organically, it just kind of branches out. Each character does their own thing, but they intersect. Like, for example, the Libby character, Libby Terwilliger, she's police. She's working with Chief McPhee, and so her story has to intertwine with the police chief. So whenever something happens to her, sometimes it's kind of on her side, but everything has to intertwine. The most fascinating part about writing this book is I wrote a book about a police chief and some of his officers under him, but I didn't write a police story. I wrote a story about a man who happened to be a police chief. So that was the most fascinating part about it for me.
I like that distinction of him. You're writing about the man and he happens to, have these other characteristics, but you're really focused on his development and who he is as a person. I think that's such a great opportunity to really go deeper into who a character is and that motivation and their dreams. And for the chief in this, not to give anything away, but he's dealing with some very pressing concerns right at the moment that put a lot in focus for him. And that was really interesting to see how many contrasts there were amongst your characters in what they're dealing with at different stages of life and circumstances. And like, as I was reading, I was thinking, this is a lot to keep track of. For you, the writer, for the reader, like it was easy. I was just enjoying it. But thinking about like how you were writing, did you have to like take notes as you were going through to just make sure that you were staying on top of everything for the various characters because you had so much variety? Or did you just kind of keep track of it in your head and go from there?
A lot of it's in my head, but what I have a habit of doing as I'm writing is every time I go back to it, if I'm writing constantly, it's not too bad. I take a little pause and I go back to it. A lot of times I have to reread. Sometimes you just read snippets, beginning of each chapter, or the beginning of each paragraph. You just kind of skim to refresh your memory on where you were, what you were doing, where the characters were going. Sometimes if I haven't written for about a week, I'll just read the last few pages, depending on what I'm doing. A lot of times that's what I'll do. I'll just reread. Sometimes I'll stop halfway into the book, reread the whole thing to refresh my memory. Maybe I'm stuck a little bit. I don't know where to go, what to do next. So sometimes I'll do that. I'll just kind of plan, reread a bunch, and then start working again.
Yeah, I'm similar in that. My writing has been really sporadic lately because we've just been super busy and had a lot going on. I'll finally sit back down to look back at something and be like, what on earth was even happening in this story? And I'll just have to go back and reread and figure out what the heck I'm doing. Because I'm not great about like keeping notes, and some friends who have, whole story Bibles and detailed character profiles. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, when would I fit that in?
That's a skill I admire. I have a habit of jotting down notes. But sometimes, like, for example, I'm writing one right now where I took all my notes that I jotted down all the time, planning to go back to writing the story. And I went through them all, and I'm pretty much throughout the bulk of them. I'm only using some small pieces that I had, and I had that general idea already. Sometimes those notes, I find, I admire people who can do that. I can't. My story binder ends up being the finished book.
It's a different approach, and it works for some people, and other people organize their ideas and thoughts differently. I think that's part of, the writing process, is just figuring out what works for you and what are the strategies that help you like really delve into what you're doing. And I don't think anybody's is exactly the same.
No, you're exactly right. The funny part about that is that sometimes what worked for one book, what worked for my Palter Falls novel, didn't work for my Maple Springs novel. Palter Falls, I kept getting stuck, and I had to plan. And I had to plan, okay, this is going to happen to that character. This is going to happen to that character. This one's going to do this, this, this. And so laid that out, and then I kind of organized it. And after a while, I had a pattern, and I knew where I was going. I tried to do that with my second and third novel after that, which was Maple Springs and my Something Happened in Carleton, and I wasn't able to do it at all. I sat down trying to think, what am I going to do next? I just couldn't come up with it. But as I wrote, everything just kind of flowed organic for some reason. So it's not always, I find it's an evolution, evolving process. Even my collaborations have started one way. We've done every book differently so far.
Yeah, it's interesting what each story needs. I started a project recently that's non-realistic, so there's a lot of world building, and normally I just kind of do that as I go and then go back and fix stuff later, like, oh yeah, that didn't really pan out, like these things are contradicting each other. But this one, like, it was just kind of escaping me, like how to get these very different pieces to fit together. And in part, I ended up splitting it into 2 different books because things just were never going to work. But with the world building, I'm just like, I haven't been able to put the pieces together as I'm going like I usually do. And I actually had to step back and like talk it out and start building some structures beforehand because I was just getting lost in it. And that's not usually how I work, but for this one project, I was just like, no, I need to get some stuff figured out beforehand, or this is going to continue to be a mess. And that's frustrating.
You're right. Each project probably brings its own challenges. Sounds like you bit off a lot, but it sounds like you're working through it. I admire people who write fantasy and sci-fi, stuff like that, because it is exactly that. I tend to lean more into contemporary fiction, even though it's usually fictional settings. I don't like to write a natural setting. I like to have fictional settings only. And typically my stories are contemporary fiction. There's no giant world building for me. I find it too much of a challenge.
Well, and there's so many details that you might get wrong, and trying to make it feel realistic. That can often be easier in a fake place because you're not stuck on those little details. And Carleton as a town in the book felt very real. And I wanted to ask you, what is your approach for developing your setting? Because your setting in this felt like another one of the characters, and that's not always easy to do.
That's a big compliment. I'll take it. I have a habit of wanting my settings to feel like a character, but to actually have somebody say that, it's a big compliment. To do that, I mean, typically my settings, I try not to overdevelop them because I want to leave myself open if I need something, need to add something, take away something, so that I haven't set everything in stone and take it from there. Carleton is ironically the only setting that I loosely based on the town that I grew up in. And I say loosely because there's a church on a hill. There's now, it used to be a Brussels sprout at Grove Place. Now they have cranberries, which it shows up in this novel, cranberry fields and whatnot. And I loosely based the town and the ridges and all the side roads on my hometown, but it's very fictional. It's not supposed to be that town.
Starting with maybe some of those kernels of familiarity and building, I like that approach. I think, starting with something completely foreign, like in fantasy, sci-fi, stuff like that, it can be really intimidating to have that blank page for where does all of this happen. And I think even with that, like kind of taking those bits and pieces from real life that reflect whatever it is you're needing from the setting in that story, I like that approach to it.
Yeah, the settings I find it very important, but they're also depending on what you're trying to create, what you're trying to tell for a story. It can be just a background, or they can be very rich and elaborate. And I have a habit of wanting to write about small towns because that's where I'm from, and that's where I find the richness is mostly. A lot of people know each other, and to me, that makes better storytelling. And so I have a tendency to lean into that.
I'm kind of partial to that as well. I grew up in a pretty small town, and like there's just a lot to work with when everybody is kind of intertwined and the setting influences how you live and how you think a lot. Really can influence your worldview and your perspective on a lot of issues. It's interesting to explore that. Well, and I wanted to shift gears just a bit because I did want to hear about your other writings and your work as a cartoonist and how those are different and how some of those skills transfer from one medium to another. Because I know some of your other novels are a little bit different in their focus and their genre.
Yeah. Well, to talk about the writing, I've done a lot of short story writing, so I do have two short story collections out. One's a horror short story collection called Dark Tales for Dark Night. The other one's Sleepless Nights, which I wrote on my own. Those are both short story collections. And that's what I always tell people that want to write but have never really delved into it. I always suggest you start with short stories because that's where you learn, develop, and whatnot. And that's how I started. From there, I collaborated with a friend on some novels. But that's why I said this novel was a bit different because this one here is what I call a drama comedy. I call it that because it's more of a drama, but there's a fair amount of humor in it. And to me, that was a departure from most of my other dark writing, which was either horror, supernatural horror, paranormal horror, or darker stories. I do have a novel called Pop the Falls that's what I call a dark comedy murder mystery because it's exactly that. It's a murder mystery, but with a lot of comedic, humorous characters and whatnot, ridiculous situations. There's a bit of darkness to it. That's why it's a dark comedy. Writing, to me, depending on the story idea, depending on the genre, and I don't want to just write one genre. I don't want to just write horror. I want to write whatever the story idea is that'll usually lean into a genre. And that's what I tend to do. You mentioned the cartooning. The cartooning is something I did beforehand, something I used to draw a lot when I was a kid, and I wanted to try to do that. So I published some materials in newspapers for a long time, and I decided to publish them in collections. So now I have the collections available in book form. But that's something I kind of pulled away from as I started writing fiction.
What would you say is the biggest difference storytelling wise between a visual medium like cartoon and short story or novel writing?
Well, see, for me, cartooning wasn't really storytelling. It wasn't like I was doing comic books. I was doing panel cartoons, which were just humor pointing. It's called geek mythos. It was pointing out the ridiculousness of certain situations, making fun of pop culture a lot. That was most of those cartoons. And I also did what I called panel puzzle cartoons, which I sold in newspapers. I did that a lot before I even started. So I wasn't really telling stories in that sense. When I started writing, I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to delve into that other side of my creativity. And short stories writing is where I started because to me, when you have an idea, you have a beginning and an end, you just write till you're finished. And that teaches you how to stretch things out, how to fill things, how to fill middle, which is probably the most difficult part for me, is filling a middle of a novel. It tends to be pretty difficult.
Well, and I think for a lot of people who want to write a book, that's very intimidating. And people will get a couple chapters in and lose some steam or get stuck or just lose interest in the idea or the characters and then it never gets completed. And I like that about short stories that you can sit down in one sitting and have a rough draft of something. And because I think just that step of completion is so important in the learning process of writing. And if you never work through a full idea, whether it's, 1 page or 100 pages, it kind of stalls where you're at in developing those writing skills. And so I love that you started with short stories and that helped you kind of build your skill and work on. Yeah, I think those middle sections are hard even when you've written a ton. They can get really wandering or they're too compact and you're like, oh, I don't have enough stuff. How do I fill this in now?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. I've actually recently gone back to short story writing because a friend of mine started a project and he brought in some other writers to do an anthology series. And because of that, each author was going to submit a short story of roughly 1,000 words. And so we just had a prompt and we had something to work with and we started writing from that. I've rediscovered my love of short stories because of that. Short stories, you have an idea for a beginning, maybe an end, depending on what your idea is, and you just write. Sometimes those make some really phenomenal stories. You don't have to have a lot of meat to the story. You don't have to have a lot of extra stuff, extra characters, different things. Just tell the story until you're done. And some of those are a lot of fun.
It kind of pushes you to try new things and experiment in different ways that you might not have otherwise. And
I've had people tell me that it's a different muscle to write short stories and novels. And they are sort of right, but it's all storytelling. I just find short stories, if you have, you're not putting the pressure on yourself to achieve a certain goal, a certain word count, a certain anything. You just write till you're done. And that's what I did in the beginning. Some of them were very short, 3-4 pages. Some of them were, 25 pages. And basically it was just writing until I was comfortable with the idea and did it where I wanted to end it. And I published that into a collection for that reason. I like the stories too much not to put them out there.
I love that approach. I've found with my students that if they don't have enough specifics when I have them do some creative writing, they get really overwhelmed and they just either shut down or they only get halfway through. And so last year I tried something new with them where I just had a bunch of cups with slips of paper and it was theme, conflict, number of characters, and it was all random. And they had to choose one thing from each of the cup, and then they had to build their story around that. And they had a random item and which point of view they had to use. And it was interesting to see how much more productive and creative they were with those guidelines in place than when I said, choose this, that, and the other. And then they'd be like, what? I don't have any ideas. I can't do this.
Well, I'll be honest with you. Had I had a teacher like you, I think I would have flourished a lot younger. That sounds phenomenal. Even to me, someone who's written novels and short stories, that idea sounds fantastic. It just sounds like so much fun. Writing on prompts is a delight. Yeah, that idea sounds fantastic.
Well, I'm hoping we're going to do it again this year, so I'm hoping they'll enjoy it too. And it was a lot of fun to read their stories afterward. I enjoy it because we don't really get to teach creative writing. I kind of have to work it in where I can because they took it out of our curriculum. But I find that they really learn the concepts so much better when they use them than when they just analyze something that we're reading. We'll see. Hopefully they enjoy it.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. You get a lot more from painting than just looking at a painting. The prompts, that's what I loved about the anthologies I participated in. A lot of them, they'll give you a prompt, and that's what you have to write with. And those are my favorite. I absolutely love them.
That is a great place to start. Well, and Pierre, we are already out of time, and I hate to say it's time to wrap up because I've really enjoyed our conversation. But before we go, I did want to remind our listeners that the book is called Something Happened in Carleton. And Pierre, where can they find you and more information about your books and where to buy them if they would like to?
So for the most part, everything's always available online. Typically, that's how it works. The publisher does have a distribution channel. They are available through various bookstores out there, but as normal, you can usually find it on Amazon. If you're in Canada, you can find it through Indigo. That's a version of what we call the chapters around here, those chain of bookstores, kind of like your Barnes and Noble. They can be ordered through any of those distribution channels. Luckily, the publisher, even though he's a small publisher, he still has a pretty good reach and he does a lot for me. He's fantastic. But yeah, you can find them out there. If you want to look me up, you can on something called PCAtoons.com. So that's PCATOONS.com, and that's my website for everything. You'll find my cartooning on there as well.
Awesome. And we'll put a link to your website in the show notes to make it nice and easy for everyone. But thank you so much for taking the time to come on and chat with me today. I really enjoyed talking to you.
I greatly appreciate you having me. I love your idea for what you're doing with your students as well. That's fantastic. I'd almost want to participate in that as well.
Maybe we should do it in an online workshop at some point, and just for the fun of it, for everybody to jump in and try something new. Awesome. Well, thank you again.
All right. Thank you.